Hello, everyone. We'll start now. I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel, The Insensibility of Our Infrastructures, Mila Samdub. Mila is a writer, designer, and curator who works on the aesthetics and political economy of digital infrastructures in India and the global majority world. His writing has been published in Phenomenal World, Public Culture, and The Caravan.
Thank you, Gulmeher. So I'm very excited to kick off our first panel on digital infrastructures. I'll say a word about sort of how we came to this inquiry, which is really just to say that digital infrastructures today are the condition really for accessing almost all the parts of our social, political, and economic lives. Every time you swipe to the next reel or authenticate your finger in a fingerprint reader, you're triggering an almost insensibly vast sort of vertiginous apparatus, like a series of kind of operations are taking place. They're sending packets through the air, underground in fiber optic cables. Binary code is transformed into images that are visible to humans. All of this depends on the labor of people training AI systems, keeping data centers running, mining for rare earth materials, dealing with e-waste. And in this conjuncture, we know more and more that digital infrastructures are becoming the terrain for new forms of politics and political organizing as well. But sort of in between that kind of infrastructural reality and it becoming politics, its infrastructures are critically always sort of mediated through cultural practices, through representational practices, and really, so before we even get to the point of politics, or sort of in between those two really is the question of how do we sort of map, narrate, imagine infrastructures. And that's what we've sort of convened this panel to discuss. And I'm very excited to first invite Aarti Sunder up to open our panel. Aarti Sunder is an artist who lives and works in India. Her interests lie within techno-politics, focusing on the study of infrastructure and society. She's also interested in the anecdotal and obscure stories of infrastructure and their relationships with forgotten actors. And we please welcome Aarti.
Hi, thanks for having me, Mila, Pooja, everyone. And thanks for coming. So I'm going to just quickly go through, I have a very short presentation which I will read out. And okay, I will just start with that. So I would like to introduce 4 ways of thinking about infrastructure and art making. I primarily work as an artist. So 4 ways that often go in tandem with each other, though they may seem counterintuitive at the outset. These 4 ways have helped me think of the layers and scales where material and the abstract come together to speak of narrative. And to do that, I will introduce one image, which will just remain static throughout. I've picked up this image for a bunch of reasons. The image, though very innocuous to look at, travels far beyond its 4 edges. It helps identify non-representational elements within it: human bodies, movement, scale, material analysis, and perception. It is an image of an object that intervenes in the world, and my concern is with the object more than the image itself, although the image does come into play. In many ways, it is delicate and forceful. The domestic internet starts with this black ball. It is a crucial element in securing connection. Typically, when internet providers come home to install a new connection, they scan the area and gauge where existing external amplifiers and routers from their own companies exist. If these amplifiers and routers exist within close distance, there is no issue. It's just a question of connection. However, if they're even slightly farther away, the black ball plus string that you see is deployed as the first step towards securing a connection. The yellow string that is seen in the picture is tightly wound around an internet cable within which you find the fiber optic cable. The black ball is then flung from rooftop to rooftop, or from road to rooftop, to tree to balcony, depending on what the situation, the cityscape is. A person on the other side who then catches the ball links the cable to the amplifier when they get the cable. Often there is an entire Parker like navigation that takes place between the people, the buildings, trees to secure this connection. This scaling of the city vertically and horizontally without scaffolding or safety measures is an inevitable and resolutely domestic path of the cable and the people who handle them. The handmade ball is opaque, presumably stuffed with waste paper inside of it, and is coated with insulation tape such that little light can penetrate it, be it water or as well as water and heat. It must absolutely not be a conductor of the electric impulse to prevent electrocution by its handlers. Instead, it travels hand to hand through the ether, helping secure connections. It is a tool that enables communication that is analog in its makeup, materially, but digital in infrastructure in concern and function. Visibility of the object here does not only refer to pure optical capacity in a narrow manner, but also in its expanded field of operations. Firstly, it is replicable. It is very easily made, thrown away, and remade once again. It holds no real value apart from its immediate use. It is too minor of an object to be codified into being made into something more permanent. It is cheap, effective, and small. It holds no real capital value in and of itself. It is an extension of the human hand, an extension of the labor and the dispensability of it, the replaceability of it. It is superficial in the way that it is handled and acutely transparent in the way it is deployed. But its opacity lies within this transparency. We would have to train ourselves to look for it and to consider it as a piece of evidence of infrastructure. The black ball is similar to the way in which its human handlers are seen. Everyone knows they exist. The acrobatics are quite popular in the same vein that electricians' movement in around dense cityscapes are accounted for. But again, it is precisely for this reason that this specific labor is also made opaque. Nimble, sweaty, athletic, and quick, always scanning for the best, shortest route to the amplifier. From depth to surface is a journey that all artists make since we engage with surfaces, optically and materially. For the artist, we are now speaking of a double surface, one of thought and the other through the act of making. Cables too make a dual journey. Cables that line the ground underwater are mirrored differently when they reach the terrestrial. Within this density of the city, these thin black skylines become the pathways for not only the internet, but also function as highways for non humans, that is, birds, ants, squirrels, monkeys, and others. Being on the surface is seen as something of inferior quality, culturally and philosophically. We are meant to understand it as not having engaged enough with something. We see it as lacking depth. Surfaces are fleeting, not being substantial enough, not being self reflexive enough, not being thinking enough. However, can this notion be turned on its head? Can the surface become the site of inquiry, its negativity taken away from it and cast instead as a point of productive engagement? In performing this act of depth, of reading, witnessing, analyzing, perceiving the image, we are now together. We are confronted with this, with having to constantly develop a situational awareness around the image and the object within the image, and to re-ask the question of what an infrastructural image is, how we come across to extract these stories, why do it, can every image potentially be looked at in this manner, and how do we as artists determine which story to tell and how. This is also a nautical vehicular image. It acts as a vagabond. It is fixed as an image, but enacts a migration across multiple journeys. What migrates are observations from history and the present location, and they travel through the vastness of space and time outside of the purely logical. Technology helps release the image and the object into the world first, and away from its own location second in terms of function and idea. This unmooring from the static location offers a dynamism, a relational approach to what we see around us, and helps distribute agency in the world. These images contain within them a materiality and abstraction, and in that abstraction comes back to transform the material through the reading of it. So, in that vein, I think of the black ball as a piece of evidence of a reasoned assessment of the nature of the visible. And this visibility is defined on the basis of the very invisibilities that confront the image. The depth of field that I'm trying to create here from the singular image is just one stop in the long chain of pathways surrounding it that are interlinked to instruments, diagrams, and 3D materials or landscape, to other flattened images, diagrams, and formalized registers of analysis. I would like to continue looking at the image and maybe sort of do this kind of migration that I'm speaking about. I'd like to sort of open it out a bit more. Insulation tape, specifically of the black vinyl kind that we see here, contains carbon black, which is a compound that is UV resistant. It prevents quick weathering from outdoor exposure. Though it does break down over time, resistance is engineered into its structure. Rather than immediately expelling ultraviolet radiation, it absorbs it and makes it less potent and then releases it. UV exists between 40 to 400, just outside of the human vision spectrum. So humans can see between 400 to 750, where everything, and that's why when we look at UV images, it's kind of bluish, because that's how it's been codified for us to see. UV also allows for extremely detailed vision within extremely close quarters, where surfaces glow, patterns are revealed, and a whole different kind of vision is opened up. For example, in some insects, birds, and flowers, UV absorption and reflection is a clandestine communication system where intricate patterns become advertisement for specific receptors only. Here, not all kinds of communications are meant for everyone to interfere with and surveil. Some maps are drawn just for a few to read, some patterns are meant for a few others to decode, and some languages perhaps have no speakers left. The black ball is also an object that is against flow and instead helps to amplify friction by enhancing grip, creating a non-slip surface of mild shine due to its glossy texture. A shape shift it shape shifts and does not contain an exact roundness to it. A squeeze can alter its contours and perhaps it will return to its original shape over time or immediately or never at all. And this makes it an apt surface for thought to linger, construct and reconstruct itself buoyantly and indeterminately without having to reveal itself the whole time. The black ball does not trade in opacity and obscurity. Sorry, does trade in opacity and obscurity, but not because of its structure and function, like the black box, but because it brings its opacity to the surface by essentially being unknowable. It is an object that does not know its own path. It wades through the city in unhindered ways, in between cables, around telephone poles, through houses cutting across balconies, winding itself around tree trunks and kicking up dust. It doesn't only beget situational awareness, but also counterintuitively asks to perform in parallel with and against gravitational pulls. Sensuous Parker invites complexity. It is, in essence, indeterminate, and this uncertainty is its very power. The black ball understands space as an extended dimension. It is a mundane object of extreme function by placing itself beneath threshold of normal perception. It exists in an optical twilight zone, hidden but in open confrontation with the world. The black ball tells you exactly how it functions as opposed to the black box, but the contours of this knowledge cannot be known at the outset, but rather through its usage. Its lack of commercial value and its ease of replicability pushes that even further by asking us to consider value outside of the lens of capitalist incursion. So, my proposal here is to think of ways to adopt this kind of thinking and making of throwing, catching, climbing, crawling in this darkness that outside of the visible spectrum, and think of what kind of risk it takes to see in this manner. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Aarti. I'm looking forward to having a conversation about this work. Next, we'll have Padmini Ray Murray. Dr. Padmini Ray Murray is a researcher, maker, and founder of Design Beku, a collective of artists, technologists, and researchers working to build community-led, ethically grounded, and locally rooted digital practices. Her work aims to reshape how we think about design, tech, and justice. She's currently an ESRC Digital Good Fellow, exploring how non-Western epistemological paradigms might alter and subvert our imaginations of AI. Padmini, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to kind of walk you through my practice as it has kind of evolved over the last few years and the questions that have arisen during the course of that practice. But I want to start with an anecdote from Ganesh Devi's work, who I don't think needs any introduction. So I'm reading from one of his books, one of his most recent books, and I quote, "In another instance, I came across a community called Gondhali in Western Maharashtra, which had persons with an amazing skill to write in the air. This writing, given the ethereal nature of the medium, involved a simultaneous reading as well. The practice is as follows. One person, call him X, stands in an open space at a given point. Imagine him to be the writer. Another matching person, call him Y, stands at a sufficiently long distance, say 100 meters away, so as to not be able to hear any normal utterance of first person X. You are asked to whisper any sentence in any language into the ears of X. X then moves his arms in his kind of gestures. He moves his arms, and Y utters the sentence you had given to X, exactly as you had said it. I checked very carefully to see if any distant hearing electronic device was concealed anywhere close to X or hidden in his or her clothes. Having satisfied myself that there was no chance of trickery or deception, I asked them to repeat the performance, first using sentences in Marathi, then in Hindi and English. And finally, I asked some of my European visitors to try this out using their French and German languages. The results in all those trials were entirely satisfactory. This was amazing. The only conclusion I could draw was that the movements of hands that X did was a way of writing in the air, which Y could see and read. The Gondhali community has followed this method of writing for several centuries and has ways of training the next generation in using this invisible script. So I think in my investigations about how to think about AI in the world that we live in, and I think Chris started off with this kind of provocative statement that we are all living in very separate worlds, and I think in my work that becomes incredibly apparent. One of my favorite anecdotes is that we were working with a group of farmers in Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu, I think 2 years ago, and I said to them, and they do use technology. In fact, we were there to understand how they use apps in their work. And I said, do you know what AI is? And they were like, ha, ha, ha. So I was like, okay. So what I wanted to understand was how they understood AI. So I said, so can you tell me? And they said, artificial insemination. Because they're farmers, right? And like to them, that is what AI stands for, and it is entirely correct. But I think it just goes to show the distance between the worlds. I mean, the narrative is so ubiquitous that India is in the next billion users, etc., etc. But for so many people in the country, the conversation around AI is not a conversation that they are having. It is something that is impacting upon them in invisible, insidious ways. And so I see our work at Design Beku as a kind of a bridge to kind of help those who are most marginalized by the lack of access to this information to understand what is happening to them. Now, the agency, of course, lies with communities and with people on the margins to decide what to do. But I strongly believe that that knowledge is required in order to take consequential action. So I do tend to think of our way of approaching technology as one less of empowerment, which is a word that I'm not very fond of, and more about liberation, right? And so how does one kind of approach tech for liberation? So coming back to the anecdote that I just brought up, I think what it really beautifully demonstrates is the absolute incapacity of AI in its current form to translate the languages, the dialects that we live, work, play in India, right? And of course, the models that are being forced upon us of AI is a model that says that intelligence is basically defined by an ability to work with language. And when we say language, it is always codified language. Now, last week we had a conference where we invited people from various indigenous communities to speak about language activism. So from the Ho community, the Santal community, from those who speak Varanchiti, which are all kind of indigenous, close to dying languages. And I say close to dying largely because there are speakers of these languages, but because of their positions in society, etc., they are being forced to forget their languages and learn the state language or English. And while many of them do want to work in English because they know that it is a key to upward mobility, there is also an infinite sadness in the fact that along with these languages will be the loss of a conceptual way, or ways of seeing the world in different ways. And I think that kind of brought me to this idea about why do we think about AI the way that we think about. And I think it's kind of wonderful that this panel is called Insensibility of Infrastructures, because something that we really think about at Beku is this idea that we call infrastructuring as a meme. And this kind of emerged out of conversations where I think all of us were kind of quite determined to not give in to the kind of capitalist mandate of scalability, that everything must work at scale, because with scale comes a profound loss of context. And so when you're building technology, the ways to kind of maybe justify the building of those technologies is the fact that it will scale. So the infrastructuring as meme approach is basically, kind of trying experiments that can work in a certain kind of condition, and then when it moves to another context, will be modified slightly, just like a meme is, right? I mean, a meme moves from person to person, culture to culture, screen to screen by alteration. And in the same way, and that alteration is often contextual. So I think that's kind of the way that we think about the way that we kind of build technological infrastructures. And I think, I'm so glad that Aarti went before me, because, the way that she talks about the very physical work that goes into setting up these infrastructures is something that we have also found, because we work with colleagues, especially at an organization called Janastu, where we help set up Wi-Fi mesh networks. And those are kind of very similarly those questions about, how far is the amplifier, what is the line, is there a line of distance? All of these become very physical questions rather than digital questions. So when we're talking about the infrastructures that are insensible to our needs, I think one of the responses that we have had traditionally in feminist thinking is thinking about infrastructures of care. However, I was saying to Mila yesterday that I am recently a little troubled by my own usage of that, because I feel like what we're trying to do by using that is to make care palatable to capitalism. And I feel like that's not actually what we're in the business of doing, because it is antithetical to capitalist and neoliberal ways of kind of imagining the world. So, bringing this feminist thinking to AI and kind of how does one bring one's kind of belief in the validity of lived experience, of phenomenological experience to AI, has kind of brought me to questions, again, around moving away from language and moving more to perception, moving to the sensory, I mean, as Chris's talk beautifully demonstrated. And I've also been confounded by why we're so obsessed with language. Like, why is the AI conversation largely around language? So I wanted to just, do a kind of historical throwback to the very kind of iconic conference that was held in 1956, which had people like Marvin Minsky and other kind of fathers of AI, and where they started talking about artificial intelligence. And so this is from a kind of a concept note that they wrote for the meeting. And it said, an attempt will be made to find how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. And I find it's interesting that there's an ambiguity: who is improving themselves, the human or the machine? And so this was the kind of, the kind of founding statement, if you like, for, AI, work in AI. But what I think is kind of interesting is that the term artificial intelligence actually comes from a psychologist called Kenneth Craik, who said that, quote, if the organism carries within it a small-scale model of external reality within its head, is able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, and in every way to react in a much fuller, safer, and more competent manner. Now, so what I've basically set up here is the difference between two models of AI. So the kind of language-led model that Minsky, et cetera, were kind of championing is what we now call the foundation model. And the model that Craik was kind of gesturing to is something that we have now come to call the world model. And the fundamental difference here is that, when a baby is born, before it acquires language, it acquires sensory responses to the world. It builds its model of the world through what it experiences, through what it touches, through what it feels, through what it puts in its mouth. And that capacity is something that we are still very, very far from in the world of AI. And that is largely because there is this very kind of rationalist, enlightenment, inflected way of thinking that has made language and intelligence inextricable, but at the kind of sacrifice of all other kinds of intelligences, which is to do with sensory and perceptions of the world. So this is obviously a big gap, and of course something that needs to be addressed. But I think the need has become even more profoundly crucial to me when I've been in conversation with my friends from these communities who are language activists, that there are entire worldviews, cosmogonies that are disappearing because these concepts have no way of being enshrined in our current forms of artificial intelligence. Now, I do want to say that before we even arrive at the question of AI, there is a question of whether these languages should even be codified. Should they have a script? Many of them don't. If they have a script, should they be digitized? Once they're digitized, what happens to them? Once they're digitized and they are do they go out in the world? Do they stay with the community? So there are many questions here about the governance of infrastructures, the way in which we determine how communities can retain ownerships of these conceptual categories, which are absolutely exclusive to them. So I would just like to kind of end by talking a little bit about how I feel we might be able to proceed to reimagine AI and what I, in my very naive non-computer scientist way, believe could be done, is to kind of privilege the world model more than the world that privileges the large language model or even the small language model. And the work that I'm currently doing right now is looking at whether when we build domain-specific small language models, which are a lot less extractive, can we actually build them to have at their center, actually to hold the most weight, both literally, because that's how you build a model, and metaphorically, around concepts that are politically important to these communities. Because I think we all know that the world is on fire, and we are at a moment where we really need to be speeding up the process of how can we work together and save each other. So for example, when talking to, say, friends in the Santali community, thinking about the idea of ecological grief, and how would ecological grief be framed in their language? Now, there's obviously no direct translation, but there might be responses to what ecological grief is creating. That might be something that we want the world to understand, the world to know. Because I think we still, despite our best attempts, we do still kind of parse these disasters and these emergencies through language that has emerged, again, from a very rationalist, very kind of Enlightenment framework. And I think that does lead to a lack of understanding. I think it does lead to a gap. And I am not saying that closing of the gap will suddenly provoke, people to become, much more sensitive to the plight of others. But I do feel like there is something about just accuracy that is missing. That I feel that there is something about how a culture living in a world at the specific moment is encountering what is happening to them, unless it is conveyed in the unless it is conveyed using the very concepts that are the foundation of that culture, cannot be kind of manifested and conveyed in its most effective ways. So I think one of our major projects at Beku has been this idea of feminist autonomous infrastructures. And I think it's really interesting to me that we feel a little out of our depth in this current conversation because it is so difficult to own infrastructures in the age of AI. We are thinking about how to have, decentralized models, how can we keep them offline? Because I think there is another kind of profound truth, which is, or two profound truths actually. One is that the role that design plays, which is why we're called Design Beku, is that all digital futures are designed futures. And so you have to think about the role that design is playing in this very, crucial moment. And the other is that as we kind of, work together to understand that the world that we find ourselves in, we must kind of understand that empathy, which is a word that I also have deep problems with, is not, of course, possible unless there is the possibility of conceptual kind of understanding, and that all technology does not have to be networked, even if it is digital. And I think that is one way that maybe we can think about how we can protect these very rich life worlds that other communities that are on the margins or that are at risk of endangerment, that might be a way forward to kind of work with them to ensure that they are still here to tell us their stories. Thanks.
Thank you, Padmini. Next, I'd like to invite Ritam Sengupta up. Ritam is an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Art and Architecture. He specializes in the study of infrastructure, energy, and the environment, and digital media through the lens of history and anthropology. His research has looked at the history of electricity in India, the history of the monsoon, and data centers and laws of data protection. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mila and Khoj, for having me here. My primary response to the provocations posed in this panel is to try to unpack this thing about insensibilities. If we are making a claim that infrastructures are insensible by design, what does it say about, let's say, what is insensible and what needs to be made sensible? Quick kind of a quick tour through the concept infrastructure, because I feel like it is a ever expanding concept and it's difficult to mark out what we are studying or critiquing or developing our artistic practices based on. So it comes, this is probably well known to a lot of you here, but it comes from a history of railroad engineering. That's when the term gets introduced into the English language particularly. But that's maybe one of the reasons why we think of it as insensible, because it does have a connotation of depth. It is not simply a combination of parts to create a whole. So it's not very easily kind of amenable to other concepts like assemblage, not even necessarily entirely to technology or media. It might have a specificity of its own in terms of an analytic. I mean, the object can be slippery. Otherwise, this is again part of the history that we inherit now. It's a term which got associated with what, like, sort of post Second World War logistics, particularly the rebuilding of Europe through American expertise, finance, and other sorts of aid. And from that sort of logistical roots, which extends in one direction to what is nowadays called logistical capitalism. So kind of a broad argument that nowadays we live, or for a while, actually, few decades, we are out of a very obvious industrial model of thinking of capitalism, and we think of capitalism more focused on, let's say, Toyota's models of production, just-in-time production, where the purpose is to conduct production in a way that there is no overproduction. You have just enough in whatever part of the world you need at a particular time, and this, of course, requires a lot of mediatic reorganization, and some of the infrastructures we talk about in terms of digital infrastructure obviously have their roots in that sort of logistics. Otherwise, of course, it's part of the post-war development discourse, whereby a range of institutions like the IMF or the World Bank come together to suggest that, and experts who belong to these institutions, that majority world, or the global south, either way, is afflicted by poverty. But this is not simply an existing condition. There are certain lacks of particular infrastructural endowments. And initially, these endowments are thought of in terms of infrastructure that we're, quite, again, self-evidently will refer to these things as infrastructure, right? Like roads, irrigation, electricity, and the like. But eventually, it also moves on to, with a change in that sort of development discourse over the, let's say, Cold War period. It's then classified as more sort of a soft skills kind of way, like health, education, or those sort of private goods. Now, yes, as Mila said, I come at this from the perspective of history and anthropology, which is sort of the two methodological ways in which I've and infrastructure studies. I got into it because there was funding, etc. Of course, but so it's been quite big for a while. Let's say 2 decades and stuff, and the range of sort of positions developed in terms of, if infrastructures are insensible, what do we do with them? And this is a quick sort of summary, and much more complicated things involved. But so there's a possibility of infrastructural inversion. So you literally turn something over and see what lies underneath it. Infrastructures become available to perception, sensibility, etc. when they break down. That's again something which is commonsensical. Otherwise, a more recent position in anthropology is, well, it's not simply when they break down do they become perceptible and sensible. They do come with their own kinds of aesthetics. So let's say a Nehru inaugurating a Bhakra Dam, etc., has its symbolic sort of value. And again, this is something which is, I think, quite commonsensical, that it's infrastructures have sort of symbolic valence beyond immediate instrumental use. So particularly in academic discourse, which I'm more sort of familiar with, a constant effort in at least the last 2 decades have been through sort of metaphors of excavation. So typically, again, turning around what is underneath, and then you make it perceptible by emphasizing frictions and other sorts of things. My submission today is that insensibility. So I've been studying this for a while through my PhD and other kind of work, and it has become more and more sort of, I don't completely understand nowadays when we make a claim about this insensibility. This is not to say that certain things are not folded into infrastructure, like Mila's introduction suggested, which we will never, as practitioners from other fields, understand. But it is not so much the case that we do not have other more ordinary handles on how to make infrastructure sensible. And today I'll quickly go through sort of 3 of these. One is, so these are things I've sort of worked on, which is why it's convenient for me. But also I believe that public discourse has spoken about these things. They've come up quite often in the way we've spoken even of digital infrastructure, which is sort of even further removed from ordinary perception. So regulation, labor, and capital. I mean these as commonsensical terms. Again, they can be quite technical in academic discourse, but so for instance, by regulation, I simply, as of now, refer to law. When I go through these sort of 3 indices of making infrastructures perceptible and sensible in a more ordinary kind of way, I will alternatively kind of hint at, again, the problem of insensibility and where it might arise from, if not only in terms of just the design of the infrastructure. So I'm trying to suggest here that there is a little more, and we might have to talk about more in terms of, because I don't have a full answer here, little more in terms of what a production of insensibility in general in our sort of time and space might mean. So the legal example here is that of the Data Protection Act, and this has gone through, some of us will, so it's gone through like many rounds of arguments, public depositions, so quite sensible in a way, and widely reported sort of legal cases where government, for instance, famously argued that Indians have no fundamental right to privacy. And then whatever, the Supreme Court argued something else, etc. So this has been, and quite simply, it's been in the news for a while. It's available, if only to a particular kind of news reading or news watching public. I think one of the reasons that in spite of this, so again, I'm offering what could make this problem of, in spite of this quite a vibrant public discourse around these things, why these issues do not gather a particular kind of political sensibility, or critical sensibility even. One of the reasons I could suggest with the case of regulation is that, and this is maybe a broader problem I'm posing in terms of the study of technology, which is that regulation, the way we've thought of regulation is always that technology, law is kind of playing catch up with technology. Regulation is always in a trade-off with what is described as innovation, which could just about be like prepackaged imports of technology, which may have had their lifetime in sort of other contexts. The labor example I've spent some time on and read out some absolute drivel to you. The very nice things have been said, and I apologize already, but it's useful drivel. It's a quote. I'm going to quote from the tweets of a person called Dipinder Goyal, obviously the ex-CEO now of Eternal. He's just moved on to other greener pastures. But so he had there was a recent strike of gig workers in India. And maybe I'm preempting something which is going to come in the following panel, but I find like the way he spoke about it is interesting or foolish, but also interesting in many ways. But I'll tell you what particularly interests me about this. For centuries, quoting Dipinder Goyal, class divides kept the labor of the poor invisible to the rich. Factory workers toil behind walls, farmers in distant fields, domestic help in back rooms. The wealthy consume the fruits of that labor without, this is the CEO of Zomato. The wealthy consume the fruits of that labor without ever seeing the faces of the fatigue behind it. No direct encounter, no personal guilt. The gig economy shattered that invisibility at unprecedented scale. Suddenly, the poor aren't hidden away. They're at your doorstep, the delivery partner handing over your biryani, late night groceries, or quick commerce essentials. You see them in the rain, heat, traffic, often on borrowed bikes, working 8 to 10 hours a day. You see their exhaustion, their polite smile masking frustration with life in general. This is the first time in history at this scale that the working class and the consuming class interact face to face, transaction after transaction. I could go on, but I mean, the point I'm trying to score from this is, I'll read the last sort of paragraph in this tweet rant. Visibility is the price of progress. We can either use this discomfort to build something better, which we keep doing continuously as delivery partners, are our backbone, or we can ban and over-regulate our way back into ignorance. One of those choices improves lives, the other simply helps the consuming class feel virtuous in the dark. So as many of you will remember maybe from this sort of tweet, sort of outburst he had, is that his point was that you should tip the person coming to your place to deliver something a little more. What I take from this is this relentless kind of, emphasis on visibility. And this part is an ironic kind of, admission of something. And that is what I just want to sort of present before you, that it is, and this has been written about anthropologists like Nikhil Anand, etc., that infrastructures are actually very visible through workers, maintenance workers in a way, but, there's obviously a discourse around it, but there's also very literal visibility in terms of many of the digital infrastructures we use. And this is not particularly sort of counterintuitive or surprising. Capital, I'll quickly kind of wrap this up. So one of the, sort of coming back to one of the points which I thought, again, just to pose a provocation. So in spite of this visibility, why is something insensible to us? And there I think we need to think of sort of local histories of why labor becomes invisible in particular ways. And in our case, kind of a no-brainer is to think through caste, particularly when you're thinking that, there's a domestic worker, but he or she, they are unseen. What are you exactly referring to as some sort of basis of your sensibility to make that claim? Capital, again, quickly, once again, this is a kind of open secret that there are various concentrations of national indigenous capitalists, indigenous Indian, whatever, capitalists, and as well as a rather aggressive push of hyperscalers who are investing billions into India. This obviously has implications of various kinds, but once again, my point here is that we are not unaware, or particularly the perception that particular kinds of digital infrastructures is leading to deep concentrations of existing as well as global forms of capital in particular locations of India is, again, not particularly sort of counterintuitive. I think we know this and we understand it is a different thing, but yeah, there's a certain kind of appreciation of it. In this case, maybe another sort of provocation I have to offer is this is a little more sort of complex. I don't want to go into all of it, but there's a particular new discovery of an old object called the national economy in this particular post-2008 financial crisis world, which leads to various kinds of particularly majoritarian investment in a particular way of thinking the national economy. Once again, the point here is not that infrastructures are not, they're not insensible by design. They have certain insensibilities built into them. But the insensibility part has other sort of provenance of thinking, ideology, if you can call it that, or other sensibilities which get built into it, which maybe there's a question of double insensibility here. So I'll quickly end by doing what academics is kind of an easy reversal of the problem, which is that maybe we can, as much as we think of the insensibility of infrastructures, there's a case to be made for also thinking not separately, but certainly parallelly in a connected way, but certainly in a specific way about the infrastructures of insensibility. Again, a quick sleight of hand here that this is not quite the hidden abode of production. This is kind of something going back to Karl Marx and his usage of what is seen and what is unseen in the general industrial sort of process. But we're dealing with things which are more like hidden in plain sight. So why we're unable or unwilling at some cases to appreciate the breaks in infrastructure, the labor that goes into it, the kinds of concentration of power and economic and social concentrations they produce, could have reasons which do not simply lie within the technology. So broadly, just to return to the point about sort of one I made in terms of regulation, I think there's a need to think of infrastructures beyond innovation centrism, which can mean three things. One is that there is actual skill in labor, so more of a techne rather than technology that is involved in them. There are older forms of infrastructures. When you think of digital infrastructure, we are. It's not like we're not, but there's a very critical case to be made for returning to what is happening to water and electricity when we're thinking of these things. And what's the third thing? Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ritam. Finally, I would like to introduce Vladen Joler. Vladen is an academic, researcher, and artist whose work blends critical design, data investigations, counter-cartography, investigative journalism, writing, data visualization, and other disciplines. He explores and visualizes different technical and social aspects of algorithmic transparency, digital labor, exploitation, invisible infrastructures, and other phenomena at the intersection of tech and society. His work is in the permanent collection of MoMA in New York City, at the V&A, the Design Museum in London, and the permanent exhibition of Ars Electronica Center. I'll add that Vladen's work is very central in sort of how we imagine and think about kind of the vast digital infrastructures that make AI work today.
Yeah. As I'm getting older, now I'm like asking myself some kind of like a weird questions all the time. And so, for example, one of the things that I'm asking myself a lot is like how I get into this kind of weird thing that I'm doing. So basically, I'm for like last 15, 16 years doing some kind of weird cartography of the invisible spaces, invisible infrastructures. And then my mom told me that basically every mechanical or like electronic toy that I was getting as a kid, it will be completely destroyed in the matter of like minutes or hours. So basically I really have this kind of deep need to look how things are working. And this is like really this kind of childish need to understand how what's going on around us, no? So, but basically, I somehow end up in like doing like a weird thing as like how internet is working or how AI is working and what kind of power relations are embedded into it. And it is much more complex issue than we can imagine. But for me, it started with some kind of like basically like investigation of like a single internet packet. So that was like back in 2015, and this is one of my favorite images still nowadays. So we followed one single internet packet and tried to understand what's going on to this little dude or girl. They're like maybe not binary thingy. So we followed and said, okay, this like in the matter of one part of the second, this thing went from the point A to the point B, C, and then we started to investigate those objects behind, and you're starting to do some kind of investigations of like data centers, where they're located, what's going on. Then you get into this kind of amazing world of infrastructures, of cables, of people and stuff like this. But basically by doing that, so I was like completely obsessed with these kind of things. So in most of the time at that period, I was thinking about myself as some kind of detective, like some kind of cyberpunk detective. Like you are like investigating, like artificial intelligence infrastructures. It's some kind of like this post-apocalyptic world. I even wanted to open like detective agency in Serbia, but in order to do that, you need to go to school for that, and it was organized by the Ministry of Police, and that things became like really weird, like, so I said like, okay, don't, yeah. Anyway, and then I draw this map basically by, and this is like this wonderful thing of like investigating, like basically we were like touching in some way, sending all of those internet packets to every device in Serbia. So you're kind of sensing how this invisible infrastructure looked like. And then we got this map. This is the map of one internet service provider. And then I was like, okay, I fell in love with this thing and stuff like, but then the main question was like, okay, what I'm seeing here, how I can read this maps, like what kind of, then you start to realize that in each of those dots here, each of dots is basically one computer, one router. There is some kind of power relation. So the person who owns that router have immense powers. It have like power to block, power to filter, power to make things visible, invisible, power to surveil. So then I start to think, okay, those like infrastructures and maps, they are basically drawings of some kind of power relations, no? And then this journey went into completely crazy. So like we did like many crazy things back then, investigating, I don't know, like the Italian hacker groups, or basically not groups, like producers of these cyber weapons, and but in a way the big one that basically became some kind of like first big black map that I did was like this one that was called Facebook Algorithmic Factory, in which we tried to basically understand how those algorithmic systems are working. So we did many different investigation methods, like how to sense what is going on inside of this black box. So like we developed, but because it's coming from the position of artist, or also like I was working with like cyber forensics and like other people, but this kind of freedom of not to care what kind of methodology you use, you just like throw methodology on things and trying to see this black box from many different angles, gave me possibility to play with it. So we, for example, for that the investigation of Facebook algorithms, we were like, like reading thousands and thousands of patents, and then those patents were like giving hints to understand maybe how some parts of the system working. Then you are scraping interface, then you are doing like many crazy things, and then at the end you create some kind of map, some kind of picture of it. But in a way, so that was like in period in which I believed in this like really utopian idea about like a transparency, like how it's maybe possible. But then by doing that, I realized that, okay, I need 1 year or like 2 years to draw something, and this something will probably not be precise at all. And in a way, so it's a fantasy. This map is a fantasy of precision, but in the same time, those systems that we are investigating, they are changing all the time. So like I spent like 1 year to understand something, and this system was changed in a matter of second. So it's like there is this like fantasy about transparency, but in the same time it's absolutely completely crazy that there is that nobody is asking. And that was like 2000. I don't have a map here. I will you can find it online, but again it's some kind of black complex map, whatever. But in a way, like, it's an absolutely crazy thing that there is no maps of those structures. We rely on them even by the law in a way. So there is like this kind of European laws on like transparency or whatever. He's saying, okay, you need to give us, like, nobody gave us anything. So now after even like 10 years of this like transparency hype, there is nothing. Like we don't know more about it. So in a way, it's still like a huge black box. But then it came like, so I understood this kind of like that this quest of like mapping all of this thing. It's like, okay, it is a fantasy, but in a way somebody needs to do it. Like somebody need to push this fantasy of like how the things works, and let's make a map out of them. And then things became even more crazy with this one. This one is called the Anatomy of an AI System. And basically, like, maybe you don't know, but the root of this map is basically in India also. It comes from my spending some time in Ahmedabad and NID, and going and seeing this kind of like materiality that was like completely hidden for me. Basically we were like going and seeing this kind of like there is like one place called Alang Beach where the ships are dying. It's the most apocalyptic place that you can see in your life. So then you see how different kinds of infrastructures, because ships are part of infrastructures of moving all of those things that we are using. Then we went to some e-waste places in villages and some kind of like so I started to work on this idea of materiality. So this map is, let's say, it's the things that we have in our hands, like the technology that we use. This is basically nothing. We are just seeing the surface of much larger systems, no? And then idea here was like, okay, how the real anatomy or extended anatomy of one, in this case this was like Amazon Echo, how it looks like what is it, what is it consisted of. And then this line in the middle here, this is all of like 5 years that I was doing before. So like investigating objects, then investigating networks. This is the same drawing. Then trying to understand how these algorithms looked like on the back. No? But then you understand also that those like complexities are kind of like n-dimensional complexities. No? So for example, if you jump into and try to follow one internet packet coming out from this Amazon Alexa device, so you go in this direction, and then if you go further, you will end up in some kind of data center. Then you are going to be processed, then you will create another packet, so it creates some kind of spectacle or some kind of fireworks of different kinds of planetary scale events. But you can also go into another direction. So for example, you start from your internet router, and then you don't go into direction of like internet packet, but you turn right into electricity, and then you are facing another complexity. So it's another infrastructure, another planetary scale system of like electricity going around, being stored, being like whatever. So you are basically seeing n-dimensional infrastructures and n-dimensional complexities that are intertwined together. No? So this is why I was like becoming obsessed and like I'm still doing it. I'm still amazed by all of these things. But then this map became absolutely got another dimension when we ask a question of like, okay, we see this infrastructure, this is this backbone here, but then if you start to look at this infrastructure from the point of Earth, then it becomes completely different. So this left part of the map is basically starting with the elements. And we said like, okay, now let's try to understand this transformation of elements into this infrastructure. And then you're ending up in another planetary scale dimension or of complexity. And that's like how the things are being made and how the things are born and what kind of, so now we are not speaking anymore about, I don't know, like surveillance or like where our packet goes and who is watching or whatever. We are speaking here about labor. We are speaking here about destruction of Earth. We are seeing another internet. So if this in the side is like this kind of real internet, this is like how the things are made. It's real Internet of Things. So in this Internet of Things, the internet packets are cargo containers, that are going around the world. So they like dig one part of the mountain and then move this mountain to another part of the world to process. So in a way, this is like how, for me, like to think about infrastructure is to think about several different dimensions of the complexities that are intertwined together. But it's also every time it's to try to understand what kind of power relations those things are bringing, because each of those dots on any of those maps are basically some kind of power systems, power relations. So in the same way, how anyone who owns the router that is after you have a power of control, in the same one, anyone who is being part of this dot have a different power, or is being, let's say, mistreated on a different way. So it depends like what kind of position you have there. So what happened, for example, with this map, so this one, it's made in 2018, but basically from 2016 to 2000, so almost like 10 years ago. Back then, this like flows of like this planetary scale factory was more or less working normal, like kind of things were like flowing. But there was like some kind of hints of like different kinds of warfares happening inside of this map. So for example, we had like a situation even before in which like, I don't know, China was threatening like Japan that they will stop the export of like rare earth, I don't know, back many years ago, no? But now what happened with this map, it stayed the same. Basically, this map will be the same forever until we don't change the whole system of capitalism that is based on extraction of inequality and whatever, no? But in a way, what happened here, like most parts of this map are becoming now some kind of like war zones of like, now it became like a war for, I mean, Greenland, this story is happening because of this now. The supply chain, you have like European Union now, like, oh, we need to protect and do what, and like, so the thing is that the parts of these maps became battlefields for this some kind of new dream about AI security or whatever, But in a way, it is a fight about capital. It is a fight about power, and this is what led us to another absolutely crazy map. And I really don't have a time to go into details of that one. So basically, this is this like n-dimensionality of complexity. I mean, I started like 15 years ago with drawing this map, then it became this map. But then if you take this map and start to think about in time, then you are getting this one. So this one, it's called Calculating Empires. And it is absolutely huge in scale. I think this is the most crazy endeavor that I ever did. So what Kate Crawford and I did in this one, we went, this is a typical, let's say, COVID project, like it started as a you have a lot of time and then you can dive into all the rabbit holes. Here you have like all the rabbit holes in the world. This one is trying again something not possible, in the same way that anatomy was like not I mean, once you try to do this kind of zoom out, you are always wrong. I mean, because like you are losing the fine grains of reality, and then you are basically trying to create some kind of version of I don't know, your worldview, and it's so biased in everything else. So we of course knew from the beginning this is going to be, you know, like our version of like how we understand different relation. But the thing is, this one is like completely crazy. It became completely crazy in scale. So this is like 3 meters by 24 meters, tiny drawings of like relation between the technology and power from 1500s to 2025. So you have like so the first part of the map, it is about like, so we separated in 4 different segments. One, it's like communication, computation, classification, and control. And so because this is somehow like a, let's say like a path of creation of AI. So you first need to collect data. So this is like communication. Then you need to classify data, classification, then you compute, and then at the end you are creating some kind of power system object with it. And we try to deconstruct that story in last 150 years. So, okay, so I should quit. So the bad story there, or like what we learn, and maybe we knew from the beginning, it was always like that. I mean, it was like, you know, from the moment in which the telegraph cable was landed in India until today, there is always, you know, infrastructure comes from the position of power, is always going to be used, and it was used to basically expand the power of the empire. In this case, those empires are now like those, like several companies, military complex and whatever. Don't have any more time, but if you want to explore some kind of genesis of like power that we are seeing now embedded in those infrastructures and devices, I am inviting you to dive into this one. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, can I invite everyone up onto stage? We're running late, but we will have a quick conversation and unpack some of the amazing presentations that we've just heard and seen. So we've really made a sort of traversal of scales and sites, which is one thing that infrastructure just does, right? From the scale of the black ball, which is a sort of functional improvised object, to the scale of communities and sort of language as a sort of particular site, to sort of questions around national economy, and then sort of the sort of transnational kind of longue durée of infrastructure. And I mean, I think one thing that really comes through to me is that, and I think Ritam also drove this point home, which is that the question of sort of sensing infrastructure is not that you like turn off or on a light switch and you turn it on and then you can see it, and you turn it off and you can't see it. And the challenge is obviously sort of much greater than that, and it's a question of sort of how you make it sensible, what the sort of materiality of that sensibility is, how that's sort of articulated to kind of existing forms of, you know, knowledge and sensibilization, I suppose. And what do you even call infrastructure? And Vladen sort of brought us into the question of sort of infrastructures that are invisible by design, I think, and at a scale that we can't really sort of apprehend all at once. Ritam sort of is kind of bringing us into sort of a question of infrastructures that are visible, and they're in fact like everywhere, but they're kind of not sensible somehow. And we can also ask not sensible to who, right? And I think Aarti offered us sort of a view of infrastructure that's much more kind of very granular, very kind of subversive, almost sort of fugitive, that I think is really, really exciting. And then finally, sort of Padmini's, I think, brought out sort of questions of sort of practices that are sort of local, embodied, indigenous, feminist, that are sort of maybe not even commensurable with what we talk about when we talk about infrastructure. So I wanted to kind of quickly ask everyone sort of what are the sort of, and, you know, please feel free to disagree with what I just said if that's if that's how you feel. But I wanted to ask everyone sort of what kind of sort of politics emerges from these views of infrastructure? Is I suppose the really sort of big question, and I can sort of add a bit more detail for each one of you. Maybe we can sort of start from the zoomed out view and go down into the most zoomed in view. But I mean, with Vladen, with your work, I was really interested in kind of how you've sort of, I mean, I think like what really matters here, like the kind of the visual choices that you're making are really important, right? And I was really struck by that you've moved from like the network diagram, which is kind of subject of endless debate in media studies, to kind of this map that's kind of, you know, structured more horizontally and vertically and kind of maybe has more of a sense of power in it, to then you're adding the time dimension. Yeah, I mean, like, do you zoom out even more? Like how, like where does this kind of way of visibilizing infrastructure go, maybe?
No, but yeah, I mean, mapping itself, it's a completely crazy process of like in which you are constantly, I mean, for me, it's some kind of like a storytelling device. I'm using it. So by doing it, I found I think most of some kind of powers and deceptions that cartography and mapping is giving you. So it's a kind of, it's a machine, it's a tool. It's a machine gun for like telling stories. No? And it also comes from a military kind of, it is a military technology mapping. No? Okay, it's an ancient human technology as well. But then I try to play, even I know that each dot on this map, it's my choice. Or when I work together with other people, with Kate or Matteo Pasquinelli and others, so it is a choice. So at the end, it's some kind of like a storytelling machine, but it is a really powerful machine that I'm kind of appropriating from a power system and then trying to do something that is maybe called like counter cartography and but I'm always aware that you know like that it's biased, that is like there is so many, you know, issues with it. But then mostly in like last several years I became obsessed with this, like a question of labor that is being like embedded in all of this system. But all of this kind of, it's a rainbow of labor. It's not just like we say like people working in mines or whatever. You have like from this kind of like a core material labor, us like prompting or us even existing and breathing and being just an object of surveillance as a work, to this kind of like a hard labor that is being done. All of this, it's part of it. And the thing is like we somehow don't have even the names of like how those relations are being like. So sometimes it's called like a surveillance economy, and then next week it's called like, no, it's a feudalism, it's a digital feudalism, and then it's going to be emotion. Now it's a vibe capitalism. Now in our thing it's vibe. You know, we are vibing with those things. You know, like it's not working. We don't work. We vibe. You know, like so it's kind of. So for me, the main question is like that we didn't define the labor relation. We don't know how to strike in those systems or how it will look like or whatever. But also that also comes from the main question, all of that, like who owns the tools of production? Like, and we are going to be doomed with this one, because this one, it's so expensive to make. Like the ones back then when we were like starting internet and stuff like this, I mean, you connect some kind of stupid computer to the cable and then you make a website and you're part of Web 0, Web 1 revolution. No? To start with this revolution, to be part of it, you need $1 billion. No? And you need to burn half of the earth on the way to do it. So you need to be in a country that have enough electricity to run it. So there is like, we are out of the game with this one. And it's absolutely clear who is going to own the tools of production. The main question is like how we are going to define our labor position and how we are going to deal with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of taking off exactly from what Vladen said, that you know, who owns the infrastructure is absolutely crucial to this conversation. And to me, with regards to your question, the politics it's purely about epistemology, right? Like, so this kind of idea of AI as something that is enhancing information at this incredible rate, but what is it actually doing to knowledge? And there's now like this, very clear differentiation between information and knowledge. And I think it's very significant that all of this, the ChatGPT moment, if you like, comes at the end of what was called an AI winter, where there wasn't so much investment in thinking about AI, etc. And then it was seen as basically a commercially viable next step to pursue this kind of GPT moment, right? So all of these decisions are motivated by, as Chris pointed out earlier, warfare and capitalism. And so what that does to knowledge, who holds it, who protects it, who shares it, and what constitutes knowledge itself becomes, at stake. And in what kind of language we're choosing to talk about knowledge, and is there knowledge outside language, and which of course there is, but we don't, there's no way of harnessing that in the world that we currently find ourselves. So I'd say, yeah, so I mean, to me, the political question is that of epistemology, like what constitutes knowledge in this age, and how do we kind of, pull apart this kind of inextricability that we've been coerced into, that knowledge is information and information is knowledge.
Yeah, that's great. And then at the same time, I guess there's a question of like, to what extent do you want to keep these different cosmologies incommensurable, right? And not sort of fold them in. Yeah, read them. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I'm not entirely sure if creating new sensibilities is necessarily creating politics. So just like infrastructure needs to be in specific, like sort of, we need a more specific object in terms of something which expands, like Vladen was showing, infinitely. So politics also cannot be like anything. Like I'll like a more limited thing which I can comment on is, well, I think there are there are sort of contingencies in this onward march of, again, the way Vladen was describing it, a particular kind of a new capitalist concentration, which are clearly leading to some what is more easily identifiable as politics. On the other hand, this part of the discussion in the morning, there is I would think of it as a risk, but then there's also like quite ontologically or whatever, like in some essential way, there's a likelihood that we have things which are, I guess, some critical theorists would call hyper objects, like the economy or climate, which, and this is to join in the conversation about whether climate change politics is a question of justiciability or whether there's something else involved. So there are, I don't know if I shudder to call it extra political or sort of, but yeah, there is certainly like this other things, or there might be monsters, or they might just be things humans have created with the rest of the world, which are these hyper objects, which are not easily serviceable to questions of justiciability. So, for instance, the anti-capitalist politics in terms of the internet infrastructure, if you see in India, obviously, like half the concern is, well, no, like, things like degrowth, etc., which is sort of rampant. And I would be mistaken to say there's no degrowth narrative in India, but like it's a bit insane. Like, it's not irrelevant, but like, the relevance has to be produced, because right now we only know of growth being, even in terms of emancipatory politics, you're actually basing it on, okay, industrial employment, become like China. Like, those are the kinds of thresholds we are dealing with, which is to say that maybe we do have these hyper objects, whether as amongst us as monsters or otherwise, we don't know yet. But
and then finally, Aarti, yeah, I think just the scale is a really critical sort of part of it. And I mean, I was also thinking about what we were talking about yesterday around kind of the nocturnal, maybe like the nighttime and the bee, I don't know, but whatever, yeah.
I think I mean I think there is great sort of interest, at least for me. I mean, I think there's some amount of importance in sort of talking about friction in different ways. And the reason is not just, I mean, in terms of friction against flow, but also friction in terms of why tell a story. Because one of the things which I do believe is that if you can think something and say it, maybe you can plan for it. And I mean, that's a very simple thing actually. But the thing is, in order to sort of, it goes back to into the naming of things, right? So, but then you have to create some kind of at least a personal or a conceptual political space in order to define what you're planning for or what you're naming. So, I mean, and I think in the breakdown of images, on the breakdown of story, in what you decide to view, what you decide to ignore, you sort of, without realizing it, create these contours. And I suppose being aware of that and making those implicit decisions explicit is what is, I mean, it's A, it's exciting, but B, I think it's something that we should, I hate prescribing. I mean, I do believe we should all be doing it, but it's just a question of like how we chose to do it. And I think that is what is at stake. But in terms of scale, scale is interesting, but it's I would prefer to not sort of silo scale into, okay, this is an object of this kind of scale, this is an object of that kind of scale, but to be able to sort of move between the microcosm and the macrocosm, just because our lives are constantly sort of making that transversal happen in any case is all.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really great point. I would like to open it up to one quick round of questions. Literally, we have 5 minutes. We have even less than 5 minutes. We have 3 minutes. So any burning questions? Otherwise, we will break for lunch. I will. Any hands? Multiple hands. Okay, over there, please. And then wait, maybe we can take 2 questions together over there, and then Maya over here. Oh, okay, and Nishant. Okay, 3 questions, and yeah, we'll take them together.
Yeah, so basically, question is to Dr. Padmini. Like you are talking about translation also in your thing. Like, how do you translate AI, for example? So in one of his essays, Wang L. Frost, that rose for machine decision is not final. He says that translation is a form of cultural transmission for certain. How do you reshape certain concepts? For example, AI translates in Chinese as Rangong Jinang, which is literal call as man-made intelligence. So it's not called artificial intelligence, it's called man-made intelligence in Chinese. So that gives them more idea that how they frame policy is also basically creating a data state and give them more freedom, because they are telling it as man-made intelligence, so it can be used like that. So when we say, for example, naming, and when we say how do we construct meaning, do you think there's a lack of this idea? How do you translate AI from ground up in India? Like how, because there is no alluding also to the idea of Chris in how do you trace technology history in India, for example? It's mostly the same language that's being used everywhere else. So we are not able to create these cosmologies, and that's why we are creating a certain kind of insensibility towards the cultural context. And how do you deal with it in your work, basically? Thank you.
Thank you all for this fantastic panel. A really interesting tension that runs through the entire discussion is one of representation or representability, and the question of it's there, but how do you represent it, or it's not representable, or these choices that you make. So really, it's a very open question to all of you about what is next for you personally in terms of the struggle with representation and or the struggle with representability of infrastructure in the sort of political climate we have and the climatic climate that we have now. A bit to what Aarti, I think, just said about not wanting to name, but saying, I want to name in only certain kinds of ways. So how do you kind of approach that going forward? Thanks.
Okay, I'll just echo again and saying this was an incredible panel. Thank you very much, and thank you for curating these conversations. Also, a very open-ended question, more like mirroring what I'm taking away. I think the hidden tension across all the presentations is discomfort with scale. Scale is not your mandate. It's not your vocabulary. It's not even your imagination, but you're all struggling with it in all the forms. I would love to understand if in your practice scale was taboo, that you're not allowed to talk about it. What would you replace it with? If it's not scale, what else then? I'm taking Padmini's provocation of an epistemological shift very seriously and saying what would be a non-scalar, not a post-scalar narrative in this instance. Thank you.
You said we had 3 minutes.
And then we can continue the conversation over lunch.
Okay, I'm just going to take the coward's way out and just answer the question that was targeted to me. But I think there are 2 things that kind of are at the heart of your question, and thank you for that question. So I think and actually as somebody who has a PhD in English literature, like that's actually like my PhD was on Byron, so I have a very kind of old-fashioned literature background. I think something that I find really interesting is that one question that comes up again and again in literary translation is that you're not looking for a word for word, and in the language of AI, token for token translation, you're translating sense. And I think the thing that we don't talk enough about is why do we have language? It's to communicate, right? So communication is different sometimes from language. And I think that, these infrastructures do not allow for that space. Like, how does communication exist without kind of, being circumscribed by language? And the other question about sense is something that, so I don't know whether people have come across those videos of sign language interpreters who are signing hip hop concerts and I mean, it's one of those most magical examples of being human that I have ever seen, right? I think it's just what they've managed to do. And I think that capacity to work with concepts and translate concepts is what we are severely lacking. And coming back to kind of what Aarti was saying, what finished with, is that when we are creating a political vocabulary, the problem is that in order for discourse to happen, if I say something, you need to be understanding with potent accuracy exactly what I'm saying. And I think so much is actually lost within that kind of distance between my understanding of what a conceptual or what an infrastructure is or what scale is with somebody else. Because so actually coming back to what you were saying, Nishan, the imagination of what scale is bounded by what your imagination or knowledge of the world is, right? Like, so if you are in a small village somewhere where, your scale is defined by just the people you know, then that is scale for you. Right, so I think, I would shift it a little bit to how does one, because these words are all symptoms. They are not actually the infrastructure themselves. And I think if we can kind of think of it like that, of what are the kind of symptoms that define our discourses, that might be helpful.
We're really, really fast. For some time, I was completely obsessed with this idea of it's really maybe poetic. So what is the world behind this border of capture? So if this is capacity of AI to capture, to get, the capacity of Google to transform each word into capital, so but what is the thing that they cannot do it? So what is behind this kind of a threshold of resolution or whatever we can call? And then I was really entertained. So for example, is there any word that is not captured and exists out there in some kind of wildness of words? And then even more tactical question, if we find the word, what to do with it, how to speak about it, because we speak about ecologists of the things that are behind the threshold, behind the border of, and I think this is crucial because we are going to be now with this a wave of automation of everything, whatever we can think of so all of those things that are behind the border, it will be our things that we will do, that we need to protect, that we need to care of. So I think it's super important question, tactical naming and not naming, and what to do with words and how to protect them, play with them, and like tactical naming, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, very quickly, there's something that I've also been thinking about in terms of scale representation is how to do it. I mean, like what is actually, how do you make sense of it? And one of the things that I'm exploring, I mean, I don't have answers, but is looking at, I mean, it may sound very difficult, but looking at existential objects or existential questions and naming it in something that is as open-ended, but also can be foreclosed if you find an object that sort of fits that. Like, for instance, I began looking at the microscope because it sort of is defined as an existential object, was once. But then if we can locate materiality there, and then we can sort of play around with the concept of the existential problem that we're kind of faced with in terms of what we see around us and what is at stake for an individual as opposed to everybody else. I mean, it's just in terms of what I'm doing personally, but I think there is a method that that can be sort of drawn out of that in some way. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that because it's a very big question actually.
Just 1 second, like to because that question was like super, the question of scale. I do not have a problem with scale at all. For example, I have more problem with complexity, because on each level of scale you have like it's like this like indefinite numbers. You know, like on each level you have infinite things that you can care of on the level of one ball. Or on the level of a planetary scale, it's always like infinite amount of things. So I have a problem with reduction of complexity rather than scale. Scales are everywhere. Yeah.
Do you want to close us out, Ritam?
I think in terms of representability, like it's difficult to, once again, like I think one of the reasons we are in this panel describing this is because what we conventionally understand representation, right? Like, so if your feed, it consists of watching lynching videos, and well, okay, I hope not, but let's say that's a possibility we could entertain in our country. But and then that is algorithmically served up to you. But I mean, that kind of engagement with representational practices is like like that demands a different kind of treatment than saying, well, there is a technology which enables it. Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but these two problems are somewhat different for me. There is a technology which is enabling it for sure, and can be regulated, etc. But there is some other kinds of infrastructure technology which well, let's say, makes this pleasurable to watch or whatever, just palatable even. And I'm not talking about just like, like I'm not talking about censorship or what is possible like to censor or not, but the fact that this is going viral or whatever. Like, so again, there's an older question of generally sort of cultural production. There is a representational world which, so it's a question of the 80s and the 90s of culture studies, sort of their autonomy of kind of a representational world vis-a-vis the conditions of production, and when will the twain meet. There are ways of doing it now, but I in my studies, I've not found satisfactory. If this is the way I could answer your question, I've not found satisfactory ways of bringing these things together. It seems to me representation can be dealt with on its own terms without immediately thinking of infrastructural compulsions, though there are those which demand their own kind of study.
Very quickly just add something to that, which is that I think it's also the struggle of being kind of forced to be algorithmic in a heuristic world. Right, human life is heuristic, right? Like it's so many possibilities and so many ways of doing things, and that we cannot capture or kind of pin down to a certain kind of representation, and that is what is creating these gaps that we are not being able to measure, which is probably just as well. So I think that's kind of at the heart of why we find ourselves struggling.
Great, thank you so much for this wonderful panel.